Welcome, I'm back. I'm going to try to make this video a little short. I just want to kind of try to explain to you the relationships between Sufism, Gnosticism, and Kabbalah. And this is part of my Gnostic series, so I'll be focusing more on Gnosticism, but still the connections between them to some extent, right? And how oral tradition is very important. Right, so I'm trying to do a lot of things, explain a lot of things in this video in a pretty short amount of time. I'm kind of busy these days, so YouTube videos. Like I know, I try, like a lot of people like my YouTube videos, and I was inspired, and I dropped a few of them last week, and now I'm back to my regular schedule, so I'm trying to crunch everything in one shot, right? So let's do it. When you get into when a traditional person talks about Sufism, Gnosticism, and Kabbalah, right? They would say Kabbalah is Kabbalah is esoteric Judaism, Gnosticism is esoteric Christianity, and Sufism is esoteric Islam. And though, I've described it myself. I described it myself like that as well. So it's not wrong technically. It's a limited explanation because the roots of many of those systems start before the material versions of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. So, for instance, you take Kabbalah, right? Judaism. Let's say Kabbalah, esoteric Judaism. There's Hermetic Kabbalah. And Hermetic Kabbalah existed way before there was a Judaism, right? Hermetic Kabbalah existed in Egypt, for God's sake, right? So, when you look at it from that point of view, then, if you take the Hermetic out and say Kabbalah would exist before Judaism and before the regular the mainstream manifestation of Judaic Kabbalah. Because one thing that people don't really realize is many cultures had their own Kabbalah. And the same thing would be many cultures had their own Gnosticism. Sufism is the one that's a little different. But many cultures, when I say many cultures had their own Gnosticism, like I said, you could be on another fucking planet. And if you achieve inner gnosis, which is based on the sun, right? And when I say based on the sun is a reflection of the energy in the inner world that inner gnosis is a part of, right? You would come to the same conclusion no matter what planet you are eventually. So you're going to have different roads, right? We see that even in Earth Gnosticism, where Gnosticism on this planet, on a lower level, there's slight disagreements on certain things, but then when it goes to the higher level, it all comes back as one. Right, that's common because realistically, these systems have to bond to what's already in you, right? So the thing is, though, there is so even though Judaism, Christianity, Islam, these other three, Sufism, Gnosticism, and Kabbalah, started before them, they're ultimately linked to those three physical manifestations of those religions, right? No question about it. So why would Kabbalah be? Because even though many cultures had their own Kabbalah, the Jews were the only ones who wrote it down. So when certain things started happening, certain knowledge was lost, Jewish Kabbalah still maintained. And then the relationship between that and Judaism kind of established because most people who were the Jewish Kabbalah that was maintained, they were already doing Judaism as well, right? Judaism was like, they had it for their lesser students. So then all of a sudden, when people look at it, they say, oh, that's the link between Judaism and Kabbalah. And it wouldn't be wrong to say that. But the wrong part comes in when you realize that, oh, shoot, there was many cultures who had their own versions of Kabbalah. So then it puts things in perspective, because then what happens, because this is what ends up happening. And this is how we get to where we are today. Let's say, for instance, because you know how I said before, that these things are schools, right? So let's say, for instance, you skip the Kabbalistic school, the Jewish or Judaic school, and you go straight to Christianity and Gnosticism, right? You're gonna have certain differences than somebody who, let's say, was like, okay, I'm gonna do Jewish Kabbalah, right? And then after that, I do Christian Kabbalah. Then after Christian Kabbalah, I get into Gnosticism, right? That person who just did that, they went from Jewish Kabbalah to Christian Kabbalah to Gnosticism, right? They're going to have some differences, especially on a lower level, than to somebody who just picks up a Gnostic book and says, this is the Gnostic book of John, let me start reading it and let me start spitting it. there's gonna be definitely certain things they're gonna have different interpretations of. Some things they're not gonna have knowledge of. Why? Because what people don't realize, because Judaism is a lot more than just the Old Testament. So they have other books as well as an oral tradition. And this is where the oral tradition comes in, right? So if you didn't get the oral tradition, and the oral tradition is an interesting thing, because even though when people can hear it, they say it's elitist, right? What if you don't have access to it? The funny thing is, there's still ways of getting it, because when a young lady asked me to decode the Bible, this was basically the foundation. This is the reason why I'm doing all these Gnostic videos. The spiritual system, gematria, and Abujad for the Quran, which I'm going to talk about later on, the ability to decoding the scriptures actually contains, in some ways, parts of the oral tradition combined with astrology. So astrology is the highest oral tradition, meaning you study the stars and you know what you're doing. The story of us is already in the stars, right? No question about it. That's the original oral tradition. That's the oral tradition that even if you didn't come from that world, you can actually decipher, and then you combine it with the systems of decoding for the Bible and the Quran and Torah. You put both of them together, you match the oral tradition that some of these people have. In some ways. I mean, there's still be some things that you may not know, but it gets you a good 70%, potentially, right? So think about what I'm just saying there. So then if you're a person who, you had the oral tradition of the Jews, as well as study Kabbalah, then you went into Gnosticism, you're going to be different than somebody who just goes to Gnosticism, right? And then you're going to be different than somebody who actually did the Jewish based on the Bible, but didn't have the oral tradition. You're going to have differences. There can be certain stories you're missing. And that's the key. And so what ends up happening is, when we say these to the school, when you go from the way you're supposed to go, from the Jewish school to the Christian school to the Muslim school, to finally close it, you pass that, go back to Egypt. That's legitimately how it was supposed to be, right? When we fell, even after the Egyptian times, the traditional person in the modern times, their brainwaves think very differently than an Egyptian or Kemite would. So you almost see, that's traditionally the difference between, like when somebody comes to me with Egyptian spirituality, who they say they're practicing it right now, and in their minds I'm not practicing it, I'm going the longer route, if that makes sense. Like, meaning they're saying they're practicing Kemetic spirituality right now. I'm saying we going through the schools of Kabbalah, which is the Jews, the Gnostics, which is the Christians, and the Sufis. You finish that, then you combine it with the ATRs that are still there, then we go to Kemet, right? It's different. So because everyone doesn't do the right sequence, what eventually ends up happening is they get stuck. So there's people in the Jewish and Kabbalistic schools who don't go to the Gnostic school, right? And the Jewish and Gnostic schools, because they're still more Western, they have more, they interact with each other more, right? So a lot of Freemasons, a lot of Rosicrucians are part of those schools in some ways, right? So because it's really Hermetic. So let's go back. It's really Hermetic, which is original Kemite, right? Which is a certain style. And Hermeticism we know of now is the Greek interpretation of Egyptian spirituality. So I can't even say it's original, but it's effective. It's more effective. Play this. You'd have people talk about it's the Greek interpretation of Egyptian spirituality. You know what you do in Hermeticism, you supersede almost anything on earth spiritually. That's the funny part. So like, the funny part is, you hear all the people talk about Greek. If you do Hermeticism the right way, you surpass almost anything that's currently on earth. No question. Because remember, alchemy and all those things are tied to Hermeticism. People get confused where somebody just spitting what they think is the Egyptian information versus somebody who's actually an alchemist, versus somebody who's actually a magician, versus somebody who's actually a theurgist, versus somebody who's actually an astrologer. And I'm talking about who's serious about the craft, right? So you would have all these schools in a sense, right? All connected to each other. Now the Hermeticists, when done right, would still go through the Jewish / Kabbalah / Gnostic / Christian / Sufi / Islam. If they done, like, the Hermeticists, when done right, will still go through them, but they'll be able to go through them faster, right? A lot of people don't really know about the connection between Hermeticism and the others, right? Remember, there's Hermetic Kabbalah. The first Kabbalah is Hermetic, right? So then, let's say somebody just goes Kabbalah, Judaism. 80% of people get stuck there. That's where they go. Then you got another person. So then let's say that 20%. So now the person who goes Kabbalah, and I don't feel like saying it over. When I say Kabbalah, I'm including Judaism, right? So the 80% who gets stuck there, boom. Then you get a 20% who go into Gnosticism, right? And esoteric Christianity and regular Christianity. So 20% makes it, but then here's what happens. There's people who go to esoteric Christianity and Gnosticism who never go to the Kabbalistic Jewish stage. That's the difference, right? So they never go through that stage. So their interpretation of a lot of things is going to be very different. Then you're going to have people, because Kabbalah and Gnosticism, Christianity and Judaism are still more Western. So the difference, the biggest gap is going to be Islam. No question about it. So, shit. Out of that Gnostic stage, let's say the 20% who will come from the Jewish stage, maybe 30% of them, which is like, if you say 20, 30% of 20 is like six people, right? Would then make it to the Islamic stage, right? And what I said, make it, they've crossed the Judaism stage, the Gnostic stage, now they're in the Islamic stage, right? But then there's people who go straight to the Islamic stage. So you get all these mixes, right? Then you get people who are Gnostic and they go to the Islamic stage, but they forgot Judaism. Or there's people who, like, you have all these different mixes. And what ends up happening is that affects your stories you have access to. Because there's some stories that Sufis have, that Kabbalists have, that Gnostics don't have. You get that all the time, right? That's why in the Bible, they don't really talk about the jinn. In the Quran, they do. Like, there's plenty that happens. So when you look at it from a certain aspect, and then everybody, like all this stuff I'm saying, I'm talking about the schools, and all of them have their own oral tradition. So when you're getting into that, and so that's why traditionally, when the books came in because they can no longer guarantee that everyone could get taught. So you put it in book form. That has its own drawbacks, of course. In ancient days, it was perceived, especially in indigenous cultures, they were perceived when you put something in books, it becomes less fluid, more stuck. Guess what? Judaism's in books. Christianity, Gnosticism in books. Sufism, Islam is in books. And guess what? All of them get stuck. Meaning, this is not to say that you're supposed to look at that and say, let me rush it, right? Because you had some people who do that. They'll be like, I'm not gonna say any names, but there was people who will be like, I'm Jewish today, and then they'll be like, I'm Gnostic today, and no, it doesn't. Like, you have to thoroughly go through the schools. That's the difference. It's not like I just be like, oh yeah, I'm gonna rush and let me just do 6 months this, 6 months. No, them stuff might take years. And what ends up happening is there's even more layers to it, right? So if I say Hermetic or Egyptian, right? A lot of people, you have the same thing where Egyptians and Nubians, right, in Sudan, a lot of their knowledge was the accumulation of a lot of knowledge that was already in Africa that they put in written form. So you might even have some people who might just say, all right, we do the Egyptian shit, we do the Nubian shit, boom, 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 boom. And then there's certain things more south of the continent that some people there would understand that the Egyptians and Nubians may not. See, and then they're missing stuff. See, when it comes to this inner gnosis, it goes deep. It goes deep. Then you might have other people who, serious astrologers, they don't do any of this stuff. They look up at the stars and they map out all this. The stars tell the story of everything. You could talk about the 12 disciples of Jesus, the 12 is the constellations. Like, you could get into all that. When the sun is Christ. I mean, you go really deep, right? Venus is related to Sophia. I mean, some people have, or Saturn is related to Sophia. Like, they have these different ways of doing these things, right? That when you look at it from a certain aspect, there's people who might just go that route. And that's why when a person on the page said Gnosticism is not an organized system really, it's a way of style of doing things that eventually other people who kind of follow the same style will get to the same conclusion even when they have a different starting point. That's definitely fucking true. You see that? Because, yeah, there's some people who go through one of those three schools. Like, there's people like you could do Jewish Kabbalah and Jewish Kabbalah and Gnosticism are very close to each other. Like I said, they are very close to each other. So it's possible, especially because the Jewish, like people who are into Judaism and Kabbalah have a way of decoding the Bible, right? Gematria, right? So you can actually do that and actually not be a Gnostic. Let's be real. You could, right? If you're doing gematria and you're not stuck to the Old Testament only, you do Old Testament and New Testament, right? Because the Kabbalah wouldn't be stuck. Maybe somebody in Judaism will be stuck, right? You're doing that, you can almost achieve the same conclusion, technically, without having to go to a Gnostic school to some extent. Because it's interpretation. It's possible, right? You might have certain things you might miss, but it's possible. But the biggest gap is between Sufism and them. So the Sufis and the Muslims will definitely have some stuff that their Jewish and Christian counterparts or Kabbalists and Gnostic counterparts wouldn't have. There's no question about that. No question about that. So, and then all three of them mixed together, fused together, corrected right, years, slide right into Heka or Kemet. The true Heka. Boom. You got it. Right? So, realistically, it makes it very difficult because a lot of times, I mean, even when you've seen people put up hieroglyphics and people put up stories on walls, some pyramid cultures put up stories on walls, even pictures was considered much higher than written words. And when I'm telling you about the written words, this does not mean that you're not supposed to read the written words. We're all in the West. Most of us listening to this, myself included, are not connected to these motherfuckers, like who coming from cultures that have those type of oral traditions in terms of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, right? I may have some stuff that family, we might practice certain styles of the ATR system that we might have our own oral tradition. Yes, but when I'm talking about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, right? Most people, myself included, listening to this, are going to depend on books to some extent. And like I said, there's nothing wrong with that, especially if you know the system of decoding that the Jews have, or the Kabbalists have, the Gnostics have, and the Sufis have. Particularly the Sufis and the Kabbalists. Particularly them. They even have it better than the Gnostics. So, when I'm doing this is why my style of Gnosticism is very different. Because I look at all that stuff. I don't just, many people, and when I say I look at all that stuff, it's not even because it's a competition. Right? Not at all. Because, like I said, you can technically, like, the Jews or the Kabbalists and the Gnostics, Christians, they're closer to each other. Right? Like, I would say this. It's probably easier for somebody doing Kabbalah. This is why even though I'm doing Gnostic videos, when it comes to books, when it comes to people, when people say what I read, I always start them on Kabbalah. Because I think the problems coming in is that if you look at it, so like, okay, look at Christianity, right? If you compare Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, let's take the mainstream version, right? Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. Christianity, Islam, and Judaism depend on oral tradition far less than than Jews and Muslims do, right? They depend on far less. So that tells you something. So what I mean by that, it tells you something is this. When you look at it from a certain aspect, right? The difficult thing is that this is why I go to people, I destruct them for Kabbalah, really. Because when you're doing, let's say, Gnosticism, like, even sometimes when I do Gnostic videos and I get people who ask questions, I would say most of the questions that are asked, like the difference to me between Kabbalah and Gnosticism, Kabbalah is a science, right? So when somebody's telling you about the sephirots of the tree and the Hebrew alphabet and certain aspects, right? Certain things, they're asking you about science, literally, right? They don't really, like in Kabbalah, yeah, you might acknowledge Moses and stuff like that, like how the Jews do, but it's not really worship. Even in Gnosticism, sometimes they inherit that from their Christian ties, where they worship Christ or Sophia, or some motherfuckers might just worship the merge. You don't really get that in Kabbalah. And then the crazy part of it is, so Kabbalah by itself will be far more disciplined Some Kabbalists have access to oral stories. Some don't have access to oral stories, so they decode the Bible mathematically and fuse that with astrology and certain other aspects of the Hebrew letters. Even the 22 Hebrew letters tell a story. And that's why they say God created the world using the Hebrew letters. Like, trust me, the Hebrew letters tells his own story. It tells a story that supersedes even the Bible itself. The Bible itself needs the Hebrew to exist. The Hebrew doesn't need the Bible to exist. That's the difference. So, from my perspective, the Jews and Muslims do a better job of discipline, and they have more oral stories to some extent. Like I said, if you're coming from a active Gnostic order, yeah, you do have your own stories, right? But all of us listening to this are not from that. Like I tell people all the time, even when you see people in other systems, when you're usually doing other systems, right? And it doesn't have to be Gnosticism. When you come to YouTube, you're usually outside the circle. Never get that shit twisted. You come to YouTube, you're usually outside the circle. Most people, even when teaching, is usually outside the circle. So even if you come in and you say you actively connect, your origins are outside the circle. Like I always say, for me, I most of the time decode it correctly, right? I'm very scientific with how I decode. So the science and the mathematics, and I'm always very aware of other systems. And if something doesn't, like when I take something, I have to match it at least 2 or 3 times in some other system before I accept it for fact. If I just get a concept and it only exists in one system, I have to thoroughly scientifically tear that shit up and try to disprove it. So that helps me decode. Most people don't do that. They get their intuition, they just act on it, right? So people will hear an Atlantean story, you get that shit through channeling, and you just start spitting about Atlantis. Things not supposed to work like that. So this is why, for me, though this is a video dedicated to, kind of for Gnostics, the point of this is for the Gnostics, to me, to respect the Jews / Kabbalists, Sufi / Muslims, respect the all traditions they come from, because it will make you a better Gnostic. Because out of all 3 of them, because you remember, like when somebody says, because even Sufism, like you have different levels of Sufism now. Like you have esoteric Islam, right? You have Sufis that practice esoteric stuff. Then you have Sufis, you have people who call themselves Sufis who just more liberal Muslims who might just sing or dance, right? So a lot of these things, a lot of these labels have a lot of different variations. But I've always found the intense weakness in in Gnosticism is that they don't have a discipline or the oral traditions. Most people come in, plug into the Gnostic traditions. There's still certain things in the Jewish traditions, Kabbalist traditions, that they can probably absorb, that they don't. And then very few of them have actually acknowledged the Islamic and Sufi traditions because, like I said, most people are coming from an Eastern Western mindset. And for me, the most effective spiritual systems erase that mindset. Doesn't mean you're not supposed to learn about those cultures. But if your system, like to me, why would a person be a Gnostic? And I can see a Christian doing it because, like I said, they're going to get stuck. But if you're a Gnostic, and there's some Gnostics who know that Sufism is the next lane, and all they would say is, oh yeah, Sufism, I've heard that before. Sufism is the link between that, blah, 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 blah. But that's it. They don't study it, right? It's the same thing with some Kabbalists, right? You see that Kabbalah too, where they've been reading Kabbalah, studying Kabbalah so long, doing their path working, that they don't feel that they have to even give Gnosticism a chance. And what happens is each one of those 3, I would say this: if you want to go to the next stage, where there's really Egyptian spirituality, you probably would have to go through all 3 of them. Like I said, I'm not counting the people who force the Egyptian spirituality. They're saying they're Kemetic scientists right now. I'm not talking about those people, right? Why? Because they're not really coming from an active chain. One of these things, it's probably not going to be the Gnostic videos, but I'm going to talk about active chains where you learn this in language, and it applies to tone, and it applies to spirit. When you stop practicing a system, and then you reactivate again, let's say you reactivate 300-400 years, it's a different system. Even if the structure and everything is the same, the tone is different. That's the key. The tone is different. So for me, I've never really, there's one thing if you want to study Kemetic stuff, theoretically, But when you say you're practicing magic and the system went dormant, it's not the same system tone-wise. Magic is all tone. Real occultism is all tone. People mistake certain people who were not even yogis in the East. They come to the West. They come to make some money, and they start just spitting all this. Like people know about vibration, right? Yeah, they know intellectually, but they don't understand how vibration affects spirit. Spiritual systems vibrate on a certain frequency. So yeah, that's one of the premise behind in yoga when they say you have to have an active yogi, right, to become a true student. You have to have a real yogi, right? Meaning not a real yogi who can energetically exchange energy from himself and his lineage to you. Where do you think that came from? It's tone. He's literally exchanging a tone, a vibration from himself, herself, or his system to you. See, the significant difference sometimes when people even going into these Egyptian stuff is, in other parts of the continent, some of their traditions are still alive. The Egyptian one went dormant. So if you just say right now, so the difference is when a person goes Kabbalah, Gnostic, Sufi, boom, 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 spin like a wheel, then they go to Egypt, it turns it on. It's still slightly different, but it turns it on because it's not dead, it's dormant. It's a difference, right? There is people who, especially the Nubians, especially certain people in parts of East Africa, who are carrying that lineage. That is part of truth. So they're holding it, right? So yeah, it's dormant, it's not sleeping. But when you come and say, when you don't understand vibration, when you don't understand the transfer of energy, and you just say you're practicing Kemetic spirituality, I'm not talking about those folks. I'm talking about the folks, you pass Kabbalah, you pass Gnosticism, you pass Sufism. Like a wheel, you go spinning right back into what they're calling Egyptian Heka. And then boom, turns on. Inner light that the Sufi, inner light that the Gnostics were talking about. That's the difference. So yeah, you can be, I would give you this. You can not study Gnosticism, not study Sufism, and you could just study Kabbalah or Judaism, and you could achieve a certain type of enlightenment. Like I said, yes. You can not study Kabbalah, not study Sufism, and you just study Gnosticism, and you achieve a certain type of enlightenment. Yes. The difference is going to be when you want to go to that final stage where they come back, and though we say Egypt, it's really pharaonic science. We say Egypt because Egypt and Nubia were the dominant pharaonic cultures along with Sumeria. But I mean the Olmecs, the Mayans, the Aztecs, these pharaonic cultures, though they had different external representations, structurally, the vibration is very similar. Very similar, right? And that comes in because I'm saying Egypt, but it's really the pharaonic science, the science of the stars. That's what astrology tells the story, right? Like how I've said many times, solar spirituality, lunar spirituality, stellar spirituality. That's what we mean. Like I'm saying Egypt because Egypt was one of the most famous solar-based systems. But it's actually even beyond that. That's just the best example. So this is why when I go through this Gnostic series, I go through it much differently than a traditional Gnostic. Much differently. So what you take from this video? 1, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, Gnosticism, Sufism, Kabbalah, schools. Schools that are connected to Kemet or Egypt or Nubia. Both. 2, oral tradition. Respect the oral tradition. That's kind of what the shamans have. The shamans have an oral tradition. Like when people don't realize that's actually like a good example really quickly, because this video went 29. I'm already 29 minutes and I want to do this shit for fucking 5 or 10 minutes. Like, yeah, I guess that didn't happen, right? Really quickly. Example. What you're calling shamanism, what you're calling a lot of traditional African traditional religions, what you're calling certain styles of spiritual systems in Europe are just unwritten. So when you say in the Torah, in the Old Testament, a lot of that stuff is that stuff written down, right? Boom. So oral tradition. So a good example. There's some oral traditions that say that Moses wrote actually 7 books, not 5 books. There's actually definitely traditions that say that, right? He wrote 7, not 5. He wrote 5. He wrote 5, and 2 of them were oral, and he passed it on to different cultures. That's a big thing, right? And so, but a tradition, some Gnostics wouldn't know that, because that's an oral story. That's an example of an oral story, right? That's an example, basically. So, in a lot of ways, though you may not have access to oral stories, I say this to say, I mentioned them in this video as well to have respect, because many people don't really realize that, in a sense, when you have a book form, you almost give it like you're like a fallen being that's being given a second chance. And the thing that could deter success is when this fallen being thinks, or this fallen being, well, many fallen beings think that you hit the jackpot, and because you read 50 books, you know what the fuck you're talking about. This whole video is not even talking about experience, right? When we start talking about magic is also experience. So you could talk about books or shit all day. You have to actually do the science as well. So it's a long journey. It's not a journey you're going to get in 5 years. It's not a journey you're going to get in 20 years. It may not be a journey you get in one lifetime. That's why Gnosticism talks about the solar body. I have to do a video on that. The solar body, where you keep your memory to next life. For many Gnostic traditions, that's what Christ was. A dude who just came in, got this shit in the past life, and remember this shit when he was being known as Christ. Many Gnostic traditions believe that. Because why? It might take a motherfucker lifetime. That's why I said it's not so. I'm saying this Judaism, Christianity, Islam. I'm not saying 1 year here, 2 years here. It's just an understanding and a respect for your counterparts. Just like if outside those three systems, most things shamanistic. The shamanistic is come from the stuff before the Bible. That wasn't written. It's a respect that's supposed to be there for many systems. This is why a real Gnostic will let you know real Gnostics don't hate pagans, because they will be like, the Catholic Church will kill Gnostics just as much as they'll kill pagans. So there was never no beef. Same thing with the Kabbalists. Same thing with certain Sufis. That's the difference between the external aspects of Judaism, Christianity, Islam versus the internal Sufi, Gnostic, and Kabbalah. So Siris King. Till next time, peace.